I just want to start by sort of raising a glass to James Buchanan, because he died yesterday.
Yes.
And thanks to public choice theory, and it's really helping me in a paper I'm writing on internet governance and public choice theory. So to James Buchanan at 93, another old libertarian. So
Coase is still with us.
yes, he's 101.
Three,
maybe.
A lot,
yeah.
anyway.
He's very, very
That's
old.
a lot,
So this
isn't
is good. This is all good. So I'm going to talk about a few things today. Simon's asked me to talk about me, which I really don't like talking about, but I'm going to do that a little bit. But then I'm also going to talk about, I think, something a little more interesting, which is sort of digital policy in general here with the Open Rights Group and Big Brother Watch, and sort of how that all fits in, and why there isn't like a libertarian digital policy think tank thing going on, and that leads me to funding and that all kind of stuff. So hopefully that'll address everything. And then I can go into the wicket, because I came back, it hasn't even been a month, so I can talk about that as well as sort of a side thing to talk about, but we can sort of discuss that later. So I'm just going to talk about me for a little bit, which is very strange, and then we'll move on to more interesting things here in London. So I grew up in a household that was Republican, and my earliest memories have to do with Reagan. So it's really good, because that's sort of where my ideology comes from, believe it or not. And I'm probably older than I look. So I went to Cornell in the early 90s, and I was part of the College Republicans there. Cornell now has a libertarian group to which I discuss things with them, which is great. But that's sort of my background. And in 96, when I graduated from university, as I was telling you all, there was this big thing happening in California. So we all got in different cars and drove out to California and started to do this .com thing, and no one really knew what was going on with that. And I started at Yahoo in 99 after having worked in various jobs, including the Pacific Research Institute, which is well known to people like Milton Friedman at the time. And I was one of the first employees, sort of early employees at Yahoo, and I ended up spending from 98, 99 to 2005 my career in content development and pushing out stores. And my big project sort of in that whole time was working on the broadcast.com acquisition. So I dealt a lot with live and streaming events in 1999 when broadband and infrastructure was not able to deal with that. So that's sort of where I come from. Somewhere in early 2004 or 5, sort of late 2004, I woke up and I was like, I'm really done with living in a socialist state. California is, to this day, overtaxed, very expensive, and full of people who like to believe that they're libertarian when they're actually not. And I was done with it, because I was constantly being personally attacked for, being a fan of Hayek on one end of the spectrum, but believing in individual autonomy on the other end. And I just couldn't take it anymore. So of course I come to the LSE, which is even less libertarian. But I always wanted to live internationally. So I went to the LSE and I did a degree in a master's degree in information systems with Ian Angel, who is not particularly anyone who's left wing. He's quite right wing. He was a follower of Nietzsche, so we had some really interesting discussions. But I was president of the Hayek Society as well. So that's how I started to get into the IEA and all the Westminster stuff, meeting Alistair, meeting Matthew Elliott, and so in late 2005, that started me sort of heading down the policy route, meeting also Malcolm Huddy, who works at Lynx, who's a libertarian, and so it sort of snowballed from there. After my master's degree, with all my experience from iTunes, I had done a lot of work in, obviously, the US, but the UK as well in iTunes. I continued to work in the music industry, which at some point didn't pay anymore. People stopped paying my invoices, particularly EMI still owes me money. But, so, I started to I go back to traditional content work, which I did with EMC and with a bunch of media companies as well. I did a lot of freelance work. And somewhere in 2010, and this is sort of the Cliff Notes version of my career, but somewhere in 2010, Matthew Elliott asked me to join the Taxpayers Alliance to do a project called direct democracy, which never took off because the funding got pulled, among other reasons. But it was, looking at basically Dan Hannan and Douglas Carswell's work on, enacting direct democracy here in the UK. And because that got pulled, I said, hey, there's like digital stuff happening, and net neutrality was this big sort of overarching issue in Europe at the moment. And I was like, I really think I need to start writing about this, because this is really regulation. It's whatever you think about net neutrality, it's still more government regulation. And so I started writing, and then suddenly I got a knock on the door from AT&T, and they said, yeah, this is great. Can we give you a lot of money to continue to write about this? I was like, yeah, but that's fine, but it's my opinion, and I'm going to write what I believe. And that's how everything sort of started down that road. What I missed when I worked for full-time in Westminster, which was from probably about May through September of 2010, was working in the private sector. So I said to the TPA at that time, I was like, I'll do this digital stuff, but I only want to do it part-time because I want to go back and do more strategy work or work with startups, and all of that I continued to do. So I don't work full-time in Westminster. I think I'd probably kill myself if I did. But I spend about 1 to 2 days a week. It depends on various things. And as a result of that, now I'm like to what I call sort of infiltrated into government. So I'm on 2 boards, one the Tax Transparency Board and one's the Open Data User Group. One sitting within the Cabinet Office and one sitting within HMRC. But I'm also now working with the Foreign Office on post-Wicket and internet freedom stuff. None of that is paid, however, which is good actually in some ways. But through the sort of writings and the reports that I've done, I've started to I'm able to influence policy in the small ways that I can through that. So that's how I spend my time, is I spend 1 to 2 days a week in Westminster. Like today I was at DCMS all day, for example. And then I spend about 1 to 2 days a week doing strategy consulting, which usually consists of helping people marketing their work or trying to figure out, navigate the policy and regulation in the EU or the UK or something along those lines. And then I'm actually doing a lot of academic work as well at the moment, working on a public choice approach to internet governance, among some other things. So that's me in a nutshell, and I'm happy to take questions on that. But I think more interestingly, the topic of digital policy in the UK and the different sort of strands and where everybody sits and why there is no digital policy think tank, i.e. why there is no tech freedom, which exists in the UK, or digital liberty, which is also, so tech freedom and digital liberty in the US. Cato in the US has a digital group, and Mercatus does, right? And they've got significant funds and serious people that I work with quite a lot. And there's absolutely nothing like that that's pure in the UK. And it's really interesting because you look at it, because you've got the Open Rights Group, which you described, I think, on the blog as, it's really effectively a Lib Dem / Green group. I think that's how you described it. With pockets of people that are libertarian, which is quite interesting, that I know quite well. You've got it's a weird group, and there's a power struggle internally on the board that's going on. That's a whole nother discussion for another time. But that's happening. And they're funded by a lot of different people, including like the Roundtree Foundation and various people. And that's interesting in its own right. And then you've got their campaign group. Then you've got Liberty, which God knows what they're doing now, because they're very disorganized in some things and organized in other things. So they're kind of doing their thing, and you're seeing them sort of reappear around the comms data work. And because of that, that's why Big Brother Watch was started. So Big Brother Watch is a sister group. They sit in the same office as we do, as the TPA. But they were really started as sort of a right-wing response to like Liberty and Org, and so they're doing quite well in the sense that they really address some of the digital issues that all of us care about. But they also deal with other things like CCTV and policing and stuff like that. So they're still not a pure play digital contender in some ways. And then I think effectively you've got Which, and you've got all those people that do digital, Article 19 and people like that. And then the last sort of what I would say right-wing, sort of middle of the road really digital group is Policy Exchange, who who, as far as I can tell, are there to appease the current government's policies, to affirm what they're doing. So they've had a broadband report, they're having something on digital health or whatever, right? Who knows? So they're doing that kind of stuff. So the question still remains around funding. And there's been a number of times in the last 3 years where I've said, okay, why isn't this happening? Why can't I find money for it? And what's going on? So the biggest problem, obviously, in the last few years has been the economy. And companies that would donate to, say, a Tech Freedom or something like that, which would be Google and Microsoft and companies like that, don't see it as a priority in smaller markets, for lack of a better word. Google does a lot of work in the UK. They fund, various things, including a lot of work at Policy Exchange, but they don't actually. They can't see themselves committing to a full-time think tank, and to me that's perfectly fine. That makes a lot of sense. But when I've shopped this around, because I've shopped this idea around for about 3 years now, it's just the interest isn't there for a full-time kind of a group, which is, again, it's completely fine. But it's really interesting that there still isn't sort of a response to the open rights group or a response to the sort of middle-of-the-road work that Policy Exchange is doing yet. So that, remains to be seen when the UK is still the second largest digital economy outside of the US for companies like EMC and Google and people like that. That isn't to say I haven't done work with these companies to look at policy, it's just that they're not willing to give a chunk of money full-time for a think tank. So I think it's something that's worth saying. It's really fascinating in that perspective. I think that's pretty much sort of where I've come to. I think the one thing I want to touch upon is sort of the non-explicit networks, right? So the spontaneous libertarian networks around digital freedom. That's something which I absolutely love because it's an undercurrent that we have conference calls and various things, and it's sort of self-fulfilling in a lot of ways. It's very Hayekian in a lot of ways, for lack of a better word. There is a group of people that exist that believe in digital freedom as an undercurrent of freedom in general, worldwide. And this does not include, groups like, for lack of a better word, doesn't include Big Brother Watch, doesn't include Policy Exchange, where we informally get on conference calls and Skype calls and things to talk about what we're doing internationally in third world countries. It's kind of almost like the Tom Palmer approach to sort of going into countries like Iran and kind of giving them translated texts of work. But there's this wonderful little group of people that do similar research. We kind of talk when we need to. We're there to support each other in terms of making sure that we can, if we go to something like the Wicket, we know that a few of us will be there. Or if we, if I say, okay, I'm going to go to, Kenya and I want to meet with people, it's kind of nice. And it's hard to really describe that, but I just want to sort of emphasize that does exist. And I know it exists in like the finance world and other industries, but it does exist in the tech world. And I'm really grateful for the people internationally who I know who, you wouldn't even know who they are, but they're there. And they understand that it's fundamental to ensuring that freedom exists in countries like, Venezuela and stuff like that. And that's part of what I'm doing this year, that I'm working on a bigger project to ensure, hopefully, countries that didn't sign up to the international telecommunications regulations and countries that did and didn't want to understand that there are alternatives. So that may mean in the future, in the next 12 months, going to these countries, talking to people who run small businesses or startups or infrastructure IXPs or various other kinds of things that need to understand that actually they can sort of operate outside of this UN mandated process and this government mandated process. So I think I'll leave you with that. And if anybody has any questions, that's sort of my general overview. And I do get paid to do this, not very well, but but usually my private sector work tends to pay for everything else that I do, because it's sort of a melding of two things, because I can do policy work for the private sector, and as a part of that I can attend different meetings and various things to ensure that the aims that I had that are just very different than a lot of other right-wing groups continue on, so that's it. Okay.